So for the last step in the video, what we're going to do is we're going to add a series of checkboxes down the left-hand side of our table. And the purpose of these checkboxes is to allow us to perform the same action on multiple rows, such as being able to delete multiple users, or maybe add multiple items to an order, or even subscribe to multiple sessions at one time. So to do that, we're going to have to make modifications to our view, which will include a column that will consist of two items, a checkbox and a hidden ID field to identify which row we're actually checking the box for. So flipping back to our view code, we're going to start by setting up a data column header, and this column will just be empty, so I'll put an NBSP or no breaking line space, and then down here we'll put a TD tag. And in the TD tag, we'll use an HTML helper to add a hidden for, and the hidden for will hold the ID of this particular row. In our case, it's for a user. This time we're going to do html.checkbox for, and this will allow us to store the value of isSelected. Now, isSelected is not currently defined inside of our view model, so we'll have to go back to our view model and actually define the isSelected property. So we'll click on our model, hit F12, come down to the bottom here, and we'll do public bool isSelected. Now this is one of the big reasons why you want to utilize a view model instead of putting everything inside of your DTO. The reason here is that this isSelected property is needed only for the purpose of identifying if one of the rows in this view has been selected. There's no need for us to push that data back to the database. It doesn't need to be kept in our DTO. We're just using it to identify if someone selected the particular row from this table. So that's one of the big reasons why you want to have different view models versus having DTOs. So we'll go ahead and do a using statement and do a begin form. We're going to point to a delete action, and that delete action will come out of the manage users controller, and then we'll wrap our entire table in that using statement. So that will generate the form tag needed for our form submission. From here, we'll go ahead and put in a button. This will be our submit button, and we'll have it use the BTN styling out of Bootstrap, and we'll have the button say delete users. And we can go ahead and take that same button, we'll put it at the top as well. I'll go ahead and also add a BTN danger style, so that'll make the button red. So that's always fun to do. So we'll put that at the bottom as well. Keep in mind that a lot of the work that we're doing in this particular lecture is simply for the purpose of understanding the fundamental concepts. So the concepts that I'm presenting here are important for you to understand to apply to your own program. So now that we have our checkboxes here and our delete users button, we can go ahead and see how all of this works. We'll start by right-clicking and inspecting the page source. Scroll down here, we can see there's a manage users H2. Here's our form action pointing to manage users delete, and we have a post. And there's our button to delete users. And we'll cruise down here to our first item, and you'll see here that we have our TD with our input element. The input element has a name of item.id. It's a hidden type, and it has a value of 2. The next line then has another input element. Its name is item.isSelected. It's a checkbox with a value of true. We have an input element also named item.isSelected. It is hidden and it is false. And the reason for that is that when we do postbacks, we need to make sure that we're getting back a true or a false. True is sent for a box that is checked. Null is actually sent back for a box that is not checked. Alright, so for us to be able to go ahead and actually click that delete users button and do something, we first need to add a action to be able to handle the postback. So we'll do an HTTP post, public action result, and we'll call this delete, and we're going to have it take in a list of our manage user view model, and we'll call the property a collection of user VM. So that will then capture all of the users, and then we'll do work, and then the goal here is we'll redirect back to index. Alright, so let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here, and let's see what happens with our collection. So we'll run this, and we'll jump back to manage users, and we'll check the first two items, or first two users here, and we'll hit delete, and we should hit our breakpoint. And in the breakpoint, we'll mouse over collection of users, and we see that the collection of users is null. So to see why it's null, I'm actually going to have to jump back to our postback data so you can see what data is being sent back. So let's open up the inspector so we can actually view what's being sent. I'm going to need to flip over to my network panel, and we'll have to do another submit. So let's go ahead and continue, and let's check a couple, let's clear that, check a couple of users and just hit delete users again. And so we hit our breakpoint. So now let's go back and look at the delete data that's being posted. So in the header, you'll see here that we have a set of form data, and the form data, let's make this a little bigger. The form data down here says ID, item.id of 2, item.isSelected is true, item.isSelected is false, item.id is 4, item.isSelected is false, item.id is 5. So all of these all have the same name, and ASP.NET cannot understand which item in the collection that we're talking about, and because of that, the collection of users view model ends up coming back as just being null. It can't create a collection because it doesn't know that a collection exists. It assumes that there's supposed to be one model object coming back to the collection, and since it doesn't see it as a collection, it just sets it as one item as null. So how do we go about correcting for this? Well, let's start by making the adjustments in our view. So I'm going to scroll down here, and instead of using a for each loop, we're actually going to comment this out, and we're going ahead and use a for loop instead. And the for loop has that square bracket notation that tells us which item in the index we're using. Well, that is what drives ASP.NET's model binder to actually understand that we're dealing with a collection of items. And then we can go ahead inside of this for loop and we can declare a variable of item, and we can set it equal to model of I. And that way we can keep the rest of our code functioning. And then we can go ahead and we'll make adjustments to the hidden for and the checkbox for. And instead of calling item, we'll actually say model of I. And that'll help the model binder know that we're dealing with an item in a collection. Now we're getting all these red squiggles, and the reason for that is that our model class is set up to be a IEnumerable instead of something that actually has an indexer. So we'll jump back up to the top and we're going to change this from IEnumerable to list. Alright, so let us go ahead and see if our indexer with our model is taking care of our issue. So we'll go ahead and do a build. And let's take a look at the source code and how the indexer has changed what's happening. So here's our inputs, and you'll notice here the name has 0.id. And there's 0.isSelected, and what this 0 is it's saying this is the 0 position item in the collection. And here we have 1.id, 1.isSelected. Again, so that's the second item in the array of items. Alright, so let's flip back, and then we'll go ahead and let's do a delete on these two items. Let's actually pull up our inspector again so that we can view what's happening with the navigation and the network traffic. And now we'll go ahead and hit delete, and we hit our breakpoint. So if we mouse over collection of users, we now have 8 items in the collection. So these are representing those users that we had. Here's each one of the items from the data that we sent. And then if we look at this specifically, we'll see here's the properties, but the only two properties that we're really interested in are the property of ID, which is 2, and the property of isSelected, which is true. So that first item that was on the form is 0, and it has an ID of 2, and it was selected. We can come back now, look at item number 2, which is ID of 4, and it is also selected. The third item in the collection is ID of 5, and it is not selected. Alright, so let's flip back to our developer tools and go to network, and then we'll choose the delete action. And looking at our form data, you'll see here that we now have 0 index.id is 2, 0.isSelected is true, and 0.isSelected is false. So each one of these indexers is now helping the ASP.NET model binder to understand that we have a collection of items coming back. So we have ID of 1, or 1.id, 1.isSelected, and again, because we have the checkboxes, you have the 1.isSelected true and 1.isSelected false. And the true is saying that the item was checked. With number 2, we don't have a true because we didn't check the checkbox, so 2.isSelected false is what we're getting back instead, because we want to make sure we're getting back a true or a false. So looking at our collection, we now have all of our items, so now we can go ahead and start working on the delete functionality.